Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course in the early modern papacy with the second installment on the reign of Pope Gregory XIII, Pope 226. We left off last time with, we summarized first his background, then developments in Catholicism in northwestern Europe and the Netherlands, and then in Eastern Europe, what became Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus. So now we move into France, developments in the Church, Catholicism in France. So we last visited France during the first of its wars of religion. Actually, first and second wars of religion. The first was triggered by the Amboise conspiracy of March 17th, 1560. That's A-M-B-O-I-S-E. That was, a conspiracy when French Calvinists attempted to kidnap the young king, Francois II, in a plot orchestrated by Louis de Bourbon, the Prince de Condé, C-O-N-D-E. And this was the origin of the term Huguenot, meaning conspirator, because it was a conspiracy, applied to French Calvinists. And Huguenot is a Swiss term for conspirator, and the connection there is that the Calvin was, in Switzerland, and he was supported and fomented and was a leader of the Calvinist version of the protest movement. The first French War of Religion ended after the death of the ranking Catholic general, Francois the Duc de Guise. That's D-E, then G-U-I-S-E. He died at the Siege of Orleans, February 24th, 1563. Oh, and I should, so we can orient ourselves here. I'll get this. All right, so here we have France. And here's Paris, France. This is then as now the capital. And here's Orleans. So you see Paris to Orleans. This is down here. And over here on the coast is La Rochelle. That's was a port that would be controlled by the Huguenots during all the wars of religion, and was a place where they could be easily resupplied by the English across the channel. Let's see. And, down here is Nîmes, M-N-I-M-E-S. It's let's slip there. This print is so small. It gets smaller every time I look at it. Yeah, Nîmes right there. There's going to be a massacre here of a priest by the Huguenots. And here's the Mediterranean, Marseille. All right, and then, up here is what we covered at Luxembourg and the Netherlands up here. And then Germany. Switzerland is over here. So Calvin is, the Calvinist base is over here in Geneva, Switzerland. So you see that it's close. I mean, even though they're different countries, they're close enough. It's just like states in the U.S. I mean, like Germany is the size of Montana. So. Okay. So Francois the Duc de Guise was killed at the Battle of Orleans. That forced the necessity then prompted the Queen Regent and the Queen Mother, Catherine de Medici, to sign the Edict of Amboise on March 19th, 1563, granting limited freedom of worship to the Huguenots. Queen Catherine, that, you remember, she's a Medici, so she's like just the Florentine, the Medicis. So she served as regent. She was serving as regent since the death of her son, Francois II, died of meningitis on December 5th, 1560. She continued as regent until her younger son became king, until he could assume his duties as King Charles IX. He was declared of age to do so on the 17th of August, 1563, though she still remained a close royal advisor. Reports of the anti-Catholic atrocities propagated during the Bildensturm of 1566 motivated Charles IX to lend financial and military support to Catholics in the Netherlands. French Huguenots, French Protestants, assumed that this was a cover story to mobilize forces that would be turned against them. So they demonstrated that no one studied history then, in the 16th century, any more than they do today. The senior French Huguenot leaders, one was still the same Louis de Bourbon, or Bourbon, the Prince de Condé, whom we've already met, as well as an admiral, Gaspard de Coligny, Coligny. Recall that the attempted kidnapping of King Francis II at Amboise in 1560 was Condé's idea, Louis de Bourbon. It was his idea. And that was the trigger for the First French War of Religion. For reasons beyond comprehension, Condé, his plan was to do it again, this time plotting to kidnap the new king, Charles IX, in order to rescue him from the malevolent foreign influence of his Italian Medici mother. The attempt is referred to in French history as the Surprise of Meaux, Meaux. It's a place where it took place. It's on September 28, 1567. Condé, with Huguenot troops, invaded a chateau of Montcaux, which is near Meaux, where the king was with the mother, the queen mother. They managed to escape owing to the sacrifice of their loyal bodyguards, but news of the failure did not reach all the conspirators in time. So on the following day, the feast of St. Michael the Archangel, anti-Catholic atrocities swept France, most notoriously being the massacre of 24 priests by a Huguenot mob in Nîmes in southern France. And that's called the Michelade, the massacre of priests in French history, Michelade. So this triggered the Second French War of Religion. So as we were building up to the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, you see, nothing just happens, So the Protestant forces, led by de Condé, attacked Paris. These are Frenchmen, but attacking Paris, the capital. The Constable of France was the senior Catholic military leader, was the Duc de Montmorency, Montmorency. He engaged the Huguenots at Saint-Denis, a suburb. Now it's within the footprint of the city of Paris, but then it was about 5 miles north. He won a tactical victory at the battle on November 10th, 1567, but it was not a strategic victory. First, because he received a mortal wound, which he died of 2 days later. But second, the Huguenots were able to withdraw in an organized fashion, so they were enough to fight again. Once more, the Queen Catherine de' Medici and her son Charles IX found themselves bereft of a general, and of necessity sought an armistice with the Protestants. This was signed at Longjumeau. It returned France to the status quo before the war, with limited freedom of worship allowed to the Huguenots. Both sides were surprised at the peace. The Huguenots did not regard themselves as having lost, since the Catholic leader Montmorency was killed in battle, while the Catholics saw the peace as acceptance of open treason, as the Huguenots had attempted to kidnap the king for the second time, the second king in a row, and had in fact assembled troops to attack the capital city. Yet they were granted some freedom of worship, so, we're rewarding this. Now, this mutual attitude led to both sides ignoring their leaders' peace agreement, plunging France into a state of lawlessness, as local bands organized themselves into vigilante squads to attack the other side, and then to avenge themselves when the other side attacked them. The King Charles IX and the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, then revoked the Protestant freedom of worship with the Edict of Saint Maur, M-A-U-R, in September of 1568. Under these circumstances, the French Huguenot leaders, Condé and Coligny, were able to obtain foreign military aid from William the Silent in the Netherlands, we met him last time, and from a German Calvinist leader, the Count Palatine. He was Wolfgang von Wittelsbach. And this was funded by financial support from the Queen of Navarre, whom we've already met. She was a Calvinist, Jeanne d'Albret, Queen Joan, in some English histories, but it's Jeanne d'Albret. And from Queen Elizabeth I of England, who was not Calvinist, but she, by any means, but anything that harmed France was, to her English mind, good for England. The Catholic forces were led by a new lieutenant general named Henry. He was a younger brother of the king, Charles IX. At the time, he held the title the Duc d'Anjou, A-N-J-O-U. And he would eventually become king himself, King Henry III of France. Queen Catherine, the Queen Mother, prevailed on her relative. Remember, she's a Medici. Her relative was Cosimo I de' Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. We've met him previously, too. He's one who supported, through through metallic means, he supported the election of his relative as Pope Pius IV. So Queen Catherine prevailed on him to bring troops to France in support of the Catholic cause. Also, King Philip II of Spain welcomed this additional front, hoping to drain resources from the Calvinist rebels in the Netherlands. So he also sent reinforcements. Additional funding for the Catholic side came from Pope Gregory XIII, who understood the consequences if France became yet another Catholic nation, either entirely lost to the Protestant movement or permanently divided by it, like Germany. France was then plunged into another abyss of carnage and ruin. The battles are too numerous to follow in this lecture, apart from the Battle of Jarnac, Jarnac, on March 16, 1569, at which Louis de Bourbon, the Prince de Condé, was killed, one of the Huguenot leaders, leaving the other one, the Admiral de Coligny, as the senior Huguenot in France. Another year of bloodshed ensued, at which point both sides were materially and financially exhausted enough to agree to the Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. So Saint-Germain, Germain, then -en-Laye, on August 8th, 1570. negotiated between the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, for the French Catholics, and the Queen of Navarre, Jeanne d'Albret, for the French Huguenots. Even though she's the queen of another realm of Navarre, it's another kingdom, but nevertheless she's aligned with the French Huguenots. So this peace amounted to yet another reiteration of the Peace of Amboise, granting Protestants limited freedom of worship outside of cities, but it also recognized Huguenot control of 4 cities in which they actually already did control it at that point. So just recognize what was already there. La Rochelle, the port I mentioned, as well as La Charité on the Loire River, Cognac, which is in the southwest of France, and Montauban, which is southern France, north of Toulouse. Realists on all sides understood that this was merely a hiatus in the homicides. Huguenots would always feel insecure if they had only limited toleration. Catholics would always regard them as treasonous for the attempted kidnappings of 2 kings and the widespread vandalism of churches, the killing of clergy and monks, and the appalling body count of the civil wars thus far. One example of the simmering hostility that erupted across the country in local episodes occurred the following year, 1571, in Paris. Admiral de Coligny, Gaspard de Coligny, the senior surviving Huguenot leader, was readmitted to the King's Council in September of 1571 as part of the agreement, part of the peace. Catholics were stunned by this, by the return of Protestants to the royal court, and that was inexplicable based on what they knew. However, the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, and her son, Charles IX, were concealing the financial ruin of the treasury, and therefore their inability to continue funding the war. So, ironically, we know more about the financial situation than most of the French at the time did, because of course they couldn't let that be known, because that would reveal how weak they were. The Huguenots in Paris had availed themselves of the peace to erect a cross, not a crucifix, a cross, on the site of the burned house of a Huguenot executed in one of the previous rounds of homicide, Philippe de Gastine. Some of the local Catholics in Paris regarded this monument as both treasonous as well as heretical. So it became a rallying point for both sides. A riot occurred at the cross in December of 1571, in which 50 people were killed. As usually happens with mob violence, many of those killed were innocent. They were just, in the wrong place at the wrong time, had no idea what was going on until they all of a sudden found themselves boxed in by these, maniacs. So this situation, again, which we know more about than the average French person at the time, provides the explanation for Queen Catherine's next move. Regarded as ultimate treachery and blasphemy by many French Catholics who had lost loved ones in the fighting, she proposed ending the religious wars in France with a marriage alliance. Her Catholic daughter, Margaret, Princess Margaret, the sister to the king, to the reigning king, would be given to the Protestant son of the Calvinist Queen Jeanne, or Joan, Queen Joan of Navarre. That son was the Prince of Navarre, Prince Henri, or Prince Henry. This is another one they keep. It's like they don't know any other names besides Henry and Francis, or Charles. That's the only names they use. So this is Prince Henry of Navarre, and he's going to be the future King Henry IV of France. So Queen Catherine of France and Queen Jeanne of Navarre agreed to the betrothal of their children. They were both the same age, both age 19. The betrothal was agreed on April 11th, 1572. Of course, completely without regard for what the kids wanted, because that's the feudalism problem. At that point, Queen Jeanne of Navarre acquired a residence in Paris as a base for shopping to prepare for the upcoming nuptials. Tensions were further raised when, in May of 1572, a private army of French Huguenots, led by Louis de Nassau, who was the younger brother of William the Silent, invaded the Netherlands on the side of the Calvinists in revolt against King Philip II of Spain. Even though France was allied with Philip, so here you have private French, just going to, so it's a mess. It's a disaster. See, religion and politics, that is no. Moreover, their intervention, the French Protestant Huguenot intervention in the Netherlands, was tactically successful. They captured Mons in present-day Belgium and Valenciennes in present-day France for the Calvinist cause. 1 month later, on June 4th, 1572, Queen Jeanne of Navarre, Queen Joan, returned from the day's wedding shopping in Paris with a fever and kind of a pain on her right side. She died 5 days later, on June 9th, 1572, at the age of 43. This made her son, the groom, now the wedding hasn't taken place yet, but the betrothal has, so this makes her son, the groom, King Henry III of Navarre, before the wedding. And so that means that Princess Margaret would automatically become Queen Consort of Navarre as at the marriage. It was widely believed by Huguenots in France, as well as Protestants across Europe, that Queen Catherine de' Medici assassinated Queen Jeanne with gloves dipped in poison perfume. Okay. Sorry, guys. Pause. Okay, sorry about that. The gloves. Yes. So, so Queen Catherine de' Medici from Florence, right? So supposedly, she imported a guy from Florence to make her own perfumes, and he was also supposed to have been a master, at chemistry, and so he's supposed to have made a perfume and dipped the gloves in it, but it was actually poison. So that when Queen Jeanne put the gloves on, then the poison seeped into the pores, and that's how she died. So any of you, literature fans, if the Three Musketeers, so the guy, Alexandre Dumas, he wrote another novel of the period called Queen Margot, and he perpetuates this story in there. And Margot is Margaret, is the one who married, Henry, Queen Jeanne's son. Okay. Pope Gregory XIII was horrified at this proposed marriage, and which was not postponed just because Queen Jeanne died. And he flatly refused to grant a dispensation for a mixed religion union. Nevertheless, Queen Catherine de' Medici prevailed on Cardinal Charles de Bourbon to officiate. He was a younger brother of the groom's late father, Antoine de Bourbon, whom we met earlier on the occasion of his arranged marriage to Queen Jeanne of Navarre. Well, at the time she was still a princess, but the future queen, who was just assassinated. So the marriage ceremony on August 18th, 1572 was a canonical farce, therefore easily annulled on the grounds of defective form when it later became expedient. So it was eventually annulled. The vows were exchanged in the yard, in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And the Protestant groom, now king, it was King Henry III of Navarre, he was not permitted inside the church for the Mass. So he was represented by the bride's brother, the Duc d'Anjou, who's the younger brother of the king, as proxy for the nuptial Mass, but the vows were actually exchanged in the yard outside. After the wedding, on the same, August 18th, 1572, Coligny, was a Huguenot leader, along with other Huguenot leaders, remained in Paris to discuss unresolved grievances about the Peace of Saint-Germain with Charles IX. 4 days later, on August 22nd, Coligny was leaving one of these meetings. He left the Louvre. The Louvre is a museum now in Paris, but at the time it was actually the Royal Palace, one of them. So they were meeting there. So Coligny was leaving the Louvre and going to his residence in Paris. An arquebus shot through an upstairs window of a house owned by the de Guise family severed the finger off of one arm and then went through. It was a lateral shot, so it severed one finger off and lodged in the elbow of the other arm. So agonizing, must have been, but not fatal. So an arquebus, all right. If you look at a picture of it, as with a musket, you may think it's a rifle, but the word rifle has a very specific meaning. The word rifle refers to the inside of the barrel. So it was a long gun, like the musket was a long gun, but not a rifle. So on the inside of the barrel, rifling refers to the boring of the inside of the barrel, so that the bullet would have a spin when it comes out. Whereas with the arquebus and then its successor, the musket, it was a smooth bore. It was a long barrel, but it was inside. It was smooth, and the projectile was a ball. It was not a bullet that comes to a point like a football, because the bullet that works with the rifling, to put a spin on it. Whereas with the smooth bore, they hadn't developed that technology yet. So it was smooth bore, and it was only propelled by the explosion of the gunpowder behind the projectile, the round ball. So it's an arquebus shot. It's still, a metal ball going in. This is going to hurt. But it was not fatal. Or, if it would have been because of infection, which would take a longer time. The assassin escaped. The attempted assassin escaped, but was recognized, Charles de Louviers. He was a lifelong adherent of the de Guise family, having served them as a page in his youth. And, of course, the house that he shot from was owned by the de Guise family. So he failed in his assassination attempt. Coligny's brother-in-law then mustered 4,000 troops, with which he camped outside of Paris. They did not lay a formal siege to this. Well, they couldn't have. They couldn't besiege Paris with 4,000 men, nor could they have hoped to conquer it with so few troops. But the threat was there. King Charles, of course, remembered the Huguenot attempt to kidnap him at Meaux, as well as the attempt to kidnap his older brother, Francis, at Amboise. All of this is the background to understand the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. On the evening of August 23rd, 1572, the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, went to see her son, King Charles IX. No one else was in that meeting. So, the good Monsieur Dumas, and notwithstanding, No one actually knows what they said or what their reasoning was. We only know what happened after. And after the meeting, orders went out for the city gates to be shut to prevent the Huguenot troops camped outside from entering the city. Swiss mercenaries employed as part of the King's Guard were then given a list of targets, a hit list. The signal, so they dispersed out, and then the signal for the simultaneous attacks to begin would be a routine ringing of church bells at matins between midnight and dawn. As planned, this was a purge. In other words, this is a purge of Huguenot leaders. It commenced on that night of August 23rd and then into the next August 24th, 1572. One of the hit teams was led personally by the Duc de Guise. At this point, Henri, the Duc de Guise, he attacked the house where the wounded Admiral Gaspard de Coligny was staying. And Henri blamed Coligny for the death of his own father, Francis, the previous Duc de Guise, at the Siege of Orleans in 1563 during the First French War of Religion. So de Guise obtained revenge by killing Coligny and others who were defending him. And then other targets on the list were also eliminated. Not everybody. Some managed to escape, but many on the list were killed. And then it started. These guys were all living in neighborhoods. Like Coligny's house was just in a neighborhood. So, and he had men fighting to defend him. And the hit team had men. So, I mean, these are battles at all these houses. And so people in the neighborhood see what's going on. And of course, they all lived through the previous wars, so they, and now that, so, and word spread. And the accumulated hatreds, that we've already explained, building up over the previous years, erupted into a murder fest in Paris and then spread throughout France. On August 26th, the king officially acknowledged responsibility before the Paris Parlement, the court in Paris. He explained it as a preemptive action against another Huguenot plot against the royal family. Such as the similar plots had triggered the earlier wars, at Amboise and Meaux. For the next 3 months, from August to October 1572, rioting and massacres broke out in 12 French cities. Usually triggered when news of the Paris rioting arrived. The total body count will never be known from the months-long episode. Estimates range from 20,000 to 70,000, added to what eventually grew to be 3 million corpses created during the French Wars of Religion. Naturally, a fourth such war occurred, because of this. During this fourth war, events covered previously in Poland, believe it or not, intersect with the tragedy unfolding in France. Sigismund II, King Sigismund II of Poland, who was the son of the late Queen Bona, she's deceased by this point, and he was the elected king of the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania. He died on July 7th, 1572, without a child, without a surviving child. Perennial threats to Poland and Lithuania from Russia meant that they could not long afford a vacuum in that position. Yet civil war threatened if one of the local nobility tried to take the throne for himself, placing himself above jealous rivals. So, the Parliament of the Union of Lublin of Poland, Lithuania, looked for an outside person to whom they could offer the position. On May 16th, 1573, they chose Henri, the Duc d'Anjou, the younger brother of King Charles IX of France, and a younger son of Queen Catherine de' Medici. The Polish delegation sent to France to inform Henri of this happy news walked right into the middle of the Fourth War, the Civil War, the Fourth French War of Religion. So the Duke, Henri d'Anjou, the Duke d'Anjou, was leading a siege of the Huguenot Atlantic port, La Rochelle, when the Poles found him. This was a serious and dangerous proposition. France was clearly not in a position to offer military aid to Poland against Russia. Yet both Poland and France shared a centuries-long hatred of Germany in general, and the Habsburgs in particular. And France did have amicable commercial and diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Turks ever since the reign of King Francis I, which they could parlay into persuading the Ottomans to exert pressure against Russia's southern border and therefore relieve possible pressure that Russia could exert on Poland and Lithuania to the west. So King Charles IX of France agreed to allow his brother Henry to accept the offer of becoming king of Poland-Lithuania. The Fourth French War of Religion continued in his absence, involving more battles, more dead bodies, before another temporary hiatus in the homicides was effected by the Edict of Boulogne, signed in June of 1573. That's Boulogne, signed by Charles IX, King Charles IX of France. It was officially registered by the Parlement of Paris on August 11th, 1573. It curtailed some of the rights granted to French Protestants by the previous Peace of Saint-Germain. Under the 1573 edict, Huguenots were granted amnesty for their past actions, but they were permitted freedom of worship in only 3 cities: La Rochelle, Montauban, and Nîmes. And even in those locations, they could only do it privately within their own residence. Meanwhile, Henri, the former Duc d'Anjou, was crowned King of Poland-Lithuania on February 21st, 1574, in Krakow Cathedral. Then, 3 months later, the unthinkable happened. This actually became more complicated. I know you don't believe me, but the 23-year-old King of France, Charles IX, died of tuberculosis on May 30th, 1574, without a son. The newly crowned King of Poland then, his younger brother, was then the next in line to be King of France. So he abandoned his realm of Poland and returned home to France in order to be crowned King Henri, or King Henry III of France. The ceremony took place on February 13th, 1575, in the traditional place, the cathedral in Reims. The following year, May 6th, 1576, financial exigency, as well as confusion from the sudden death of Charles IX and delays in Henry's returning from Poland, prompted the new king, Henri III, to sign the Edict of Boulogne, Beaulieu, which granted sweeping concessions to the Huguenots. The edict granted the right of public worship to the Huguenots everywhere in France, except the city of Paris, and except in the presence where the royal court happened to be, if it was traveling outside of Paris. Second, Huguenots were permitted to build churches outside of Paris, and compensation for Huguenot families harmed during the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre was stipulated. So once again, we know more about the background to this edict than did most of the French at the time. They were not aware of the desperate financial situation of the crown. So the money, that was temporary. That they got some money from Pope Gregory and from Philip, but because of other situations that we'll cover in this session and the next, their ability to channel money was limited. And once that financial support was cut off, then Henry, he couldn't pay his troops anymore. But he couldn't very well admit that, because then that would make him look even weaker. So he presented the edict and the concessions as a gesture of goodwill on his accession to the throne. So this is like an amnesty. It's to celebrate my becoming king. And he hoped that it would restore peace. It did not. Many Catholics in France then turned on the new king. They regarded the edict as a reward for treason and civil war, as well as endorsing heresy. And they feared that would lead to France becoming a Protestant nation, like England, Scotland, Sweden, or being divided permanently, between Catholic and Protestant, like Germany and Switzerland. The ranking Duc de Guise, who just for the sake of confusion was also named Henry, solidified resistance to this Edict of Beaulieu by forming the Catholic League. That's what it was actually called, the Catholic League, or the Holy League, in 1576, the same year as the edict. The purpose of the League was straightforward and publicly stated: the eradication of Protestantism from France, and the replacement of King Henry III for what they regarded as his betrayal of the faith and his betrayal of those who died fighting for the monarchy and the church in the previous wars, including Henry Henry de Guise's own father, the late Duke Francois de Guise. Obviously, another religious civil war was inevitable. But before that took place, another development occurred, another one which no one expected. On June 10th, 1584, King Henry III of France, his younger brother, died at the age of 29. This was Francois, the Duc d'Alençon. He was the youngest son of the late King Henry II and Queen Catherine de' Medici, who's still around. Apart from the surprise at his death, he died of malaria, or a tertian ague, as they called it. He was at the time the heir presumptive to the French throne, since the reigning king Henry III had no sons. And though the king Henry was married, he was actually married to a member of the de Guise family. Nevertheless, this is a family-friendly channel, so I'll say his proclivities were not conducive to reproduction. Following the complex genealogy of all the royal and aristocratic intermarriage, the next in line, the next heir to the throne of France, was none other than the reigning King of Navarre, a Calvinist, who, just for the sake of confusion, was also named Henry, and also the same numeral. So he's Henry III, King of Navarre. The reigning monarch of France is Henry III of France, Henri III. And the guy who came up with the Catholic League, who's mad at both of them, is also named Henry, the Duc de Guise. And his wedding, so the next heir, in other words, was the groom at the wedding. That was followed by the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, the son of Antoine de Bourbon and the late Queen Joan of Navarre. So where was he? All right. Well, after the wedding, since the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre happened so soon after the wedding, he was still in Paris when it happened, and he was essentially kept under house arrest. and not allowed to return to his own kingdom of Navarre. He only saved his life by converting to Catholicism. Yet no one believed his conversion to be genuine, and it wasn't. So Catholics in France faced the prospect of a Calvinist becoming king of France by right of inheritance, legally. This led to the next French War of Religion, the War of the Three Henries, from 1587 to 1589. But that occurred in the reign of the next pope, so we'll pause in our survey of French Catholicism for now. Let's see how much time. Yeah, we'll keep going. And return to see what else was going on in Gregory's reign. Recall that in the third period of the Council of Trent, the council mandated the creation of a seminary system to train clergy for the church. Ideally, each cathedral was responsible for educating its own young men for holy orders. Such a program, implemented in so many different places in the whole Catholic world, would naturally take time. So during the periods of the council's interruption, recall that Pope Julius III agreed to a project proposed by the Jesuits to supply the deficiency until dioceses were prepared to do so themselves. So the German college, the Collegium Germanicum, was created in Rome on August 31st, 1552. It was located in Rome to keep it safe from the chaos and the violence in Germany, as well as to establish a bond between the seminarians and the papacy. The program of what would later be called formation, priestly formation, was one of the models for later seminary development. But strictly speaking, it was not a Tridentine seminary because it was not tied to a cathedral, but instead was to serve the needs of an entire nation. Also, the papal legate to England, the late Cardinal Reginald Pole, in 1555 implemented a cathedral-based seminary system, but did not actually develop because England soon relapsed into Protestantism after the death of Queen Mary I, as we already covered. The first model, which combined both, the formation of the Jesuit German College with the Tridentine concept of a cathedral-based seminary, took place in Milan, when St. Charles Borromeo served as its cardinal archbishop. By the time of Gregory XIII's pontificate, it was clear that the ideal of Trent, of every cathedral training its own clergy, would never happen, because there were some dioceses that just didn't have the resources. So he decided to make a virtue out of necessity and established a network of national clerical colleges in Rome, hoping to not only provide uniformity, but also uniformity of formation, but also to instill an attachment to Rome in the hearts of the seminarians, while they were young, which hopefully they would keep, when they went back home. To this end, Gregory XIII established the Collegio Romano, the Roman College, in 1572, under the care of the Jesuits, which was later renamed in his honor as the Gregorian University, a name it still bears to this day, and is still under the care of the Jesuits. He further created an English college in 1579, a Hungarian college, an Armenian college, a Greek college, and a Maronite college. This model of a national house of formation in Rome for seminarians to live while studying at the university continues to this day, and it remains a parallel to the system of cathedral or diocesan-based seminaries. It has never happened that either model has been able to meet the needs of the whole church. So both models have endured. They still do. Perhaps the most famous action of Pope Gregory XIII, which, everyone actually knows, but maybe not really know, is the reform of the calendar. So the calendar we use, the Gregorian calendar, is named for him, this Gregory, Pope Gregory XIII. Okay, so to summarize the problem, the calculation of time was a perennial source of confusion in the West. 2 distinct calendars operated simultaneously: a lunar calendar based on the moon and a solar calendar based on the sun. But there were problems with each. The solar calendar. All right. The astronomical year, meaning the amount of time it took for the Earth to reach the same point in space. Or depending, from the perspective of the time it took the sun to reach the same, because we'll get to that. But that amount of time did not match the seasons of the year because of the tilt of the Earth and the elliptical orbit. The orbit is not a perfect circle. It's an ellipse. But that was not fully understood at the time. The calendar year, on a solar basis, based on the sun, had last been calculated during the lifetime of Julius Caesar, the Julius Caesar, hence the Julian Calendar. And that was over 1,600 years earlier. It was ahead of the true astronomical year, meaning, position to position, one rotation. It was ahead of the true astronomical year by 11 minutes and 14 seconds each year. So the Julian year was 365 days and 6 hours. But the true year, from point to returning to that point, is 365 days, 5 hours, and 48 minutes. Meaning that the Julian year exceeded the astronomical year by 1 full day every 128 years. The year, so that's the solar problems with the solar calendar. Now, what about the moon? There were problems with the lunar calendar as well. So the year as measured according to the moon only synchronized with the solar year every 19 years, or every 235 lunar months. Yet even at its closest point, at the closest point of synchronization, the lunar cycle was behind the solar cycle by 1 hour, 27 minutes, and 30 seconds, resulting in the drift of an entire day every 312.7 years. The lunar calendar could not be dispensed with entirely, as it was used to calculate the date of Easter. Easter is the first Sunday following the first full moon that occurs after the spring equinox. The equinox is the point of the year when day and night are of equal length. And wherever you put Easter, where that calculation affects the placement of by counting backwards of Ash Wednesday, of Lent, and then counting forward, Ascension and Pentecost. Neither could the solar calendar be dispensed with, as it was the basis for calculating the Annunciation, Christmas, and all the saints' feast days. The desire to correct this problem was centuries old, but no one had the expertise or the authority to accomplish it. The reform was first proposed by one of the Medici popes, Leo X, in 1514. Being a Renaissance man, a Medici, a patron of learning, Pope Leo funded a project to research how to solve this. Pope Leo's secretary located through curio contacts a Polish priest who had studied at Bologna, so that's how he was known in Italy. But he was back in Poland, and he was known to be an extraordinary polymath, just interested in everything, and specifically in mathematics and astronomy. He had returned to Poland by this point, but he was nonetheless interested, and he had already done some work and some observations. His name was Nicholas Copernicus, lived from 1473 to 1543. Copernicus warned the papal secretary that the problem could not be solved until the proper relationship between the sun and the earth was established. Now, the papal secretary was not scientifically inclined, so the warning just went completely over his head. And Copernicus, was being deliberately vague about the warning, for his own protection. What he should have asked was whether or not the church was prepared to accept the proposition that the earth was not the center of the universe. Copernicus worked on the problem for decades. He developed entirely new astrophysical algorithms to quantify concepts that he could only theorize based on the limited observations he was able to make. And those are very limited because of the instrumental limitations. He didn't have a Hubble telescope up there in orbit. The final result was De Revolutionibus, published in 1543, after his death, safely after his death, by one of his students, Johann Rheticus. In this work, Copernicus argued that the sun, not the earth, was the center, which completely contradicted the prevailing astronomical model from antiquity, that of Claudius Ptolemy, who lived from 83 to 161 A.D. He was an Alexandrian Greek who posited his astronomy in a famous work titled The Almagest, and his astrology in the Tetrabulos, the 4 books. He explained the movement of the planets and the stars and the reason they did not fall by conceiving of each being embedded in one of many concentric spheres of ether. Ether is a hypothetical element, the hypothetical fifth element that existed, invisible, but yet existing and having strength. Anomalous movements of some bodies in space that could be observed was explained by smaller spheres, which kept them moving in their own circular pattern, the epicycles. Copernicus refuted this system, replacing it with a geocentric or earth-centered model. Replacing the geocentric earth-centered model with a heliocentric sun-centered model. Since his reasoning was in the form of dense mathematics, which maybe half a dozen people on the planet could understand, it caused no controversy at the time. His book was copied and stored in the great university libraries of Europe. The first scholars to make practical use of Copernicus's astrophysics and his math were an Italian, Aloysius Lilio, Lilio, and a German Jesuit, Bavarian Jesuit, Christopher Clavius. Using Copernicus as a beginning and adding years of their own observations and work, they presented Pope Gregory with a calendar that ran ahead of the true year by only one day every 3,323 years. Their solution? Into the solar calendar, they inserted a leap year every 4 years, omitting it in a century year unless that century year was divisible by 4. To correct the drift, since the Julian calendar was instituted, they proposed nothing less than dropping 10 days at once. Pope Gregory agreed. He proclaimed this binding, of course it was only, the Catholic world, that by means of a decree, inter gravissimus, meaning among the most serious, commanding that it would take effect on October 4th, 1582, meaning that you went to sleep on October 4th and woke up on October 15th instead of October 5th. As a note of historical interest, St. Teresa of Avila, whom we're going to cover, she died during the reign of Pope Gregory, so we're going to cover her. She died on the night of the change, which complicates the placement of her feast day. Before we get to her, the Carranza trial. I mentioned this earlier. It's something that happened before Gregory became Pope. He was involved in before he became Pope, and so he was still involved. This was a hideous embarrassment for the Church and for Spain. It's a long and sad story. To summarize, the guy, Bartholomew Carranza, Carranza, was born in Navarre, the Kingdom of Navarre, in 1503. He became a Dominican in 1520. He earned a reputation as a theologian, even attended the Council of Trent as a peritus, a theological advisor. Twice at the council, he argued for positions which the council ultimately rejected. First, he argued that the requirement of bishops to reside in their see was divine law, which would mean that all popes who had sent bishops on diplomatic missions had been in a state of mortal sin. So, of course, the council, rejected that. Second, he argued for the double justification compromise with the Lutherans, first put forward by the Augustinian Master General, Saripondo. This is, asserting that at baptism we receive the first justification of sanctifying grace. And then during adulthood we receive a second justification through the act of faith in Christ, accepting Jesus as our Lord and Savior. And at that point, the merits of Christ cloak over our faults with his own justice. Now, Carranza accepted the final vote of the council that they rejected both of these propositions. And so, there's all right. That happens, and he was well regarded by many, such that twice he was offered to be a bishop, but he refused because they were both in mission lands. One was in Cusco in Peru, and the other the Canary Islands, off the coast of Africa. Finally, he was named Archbishop of Toledo, which meant the primate of Spain, the senior prelate in Spain, on May 31st, 1557. In this capacity, he produced a catechism with a commentary in 1558. It reflected his desire to compromise with the protest movement in the hopes that the schism would not become permanent as it had with the Greek Orthodox. His technique was to quote short phrases in catechism form, indicating that they were consistent with Catholic doctrine, and then pointing out that they were taken from the writings of Luther or Calvin. His point being that while both men were heretical in some of their assertions, not every single thing they wrote was in fact heretical. He was certain that if all the areas of agreement could be enumerated, and he thought that the number of statements of agreement would extend into the thousands, that would be the basis for a settlement and reunion. In the same year the work was published, Carranza was arrested by the Spanish Inquisition on August 22nd, 1558, for publishing heresy. He denied that he accepted all the statements in question, merely that he put them forward as not being inconsistent with church doctrine, and therefore as items that could legitimately be open to discussion. Now, that kind of nuance that's not an argument to make before the Spanish Inquisition. They were not interested in that kind of reasoning. And even King Philip II of Spain, who personally liked Carranza, would not lift a finger to help him in this situation. The only avenue left to Carranza was an appeal to the Pope. Now, it was his misfortune that the Pope at the time was Paul IV, whom we've already covered. And remember, he detested Spain and would never exert any effort to aid any Spaniard under any circumstances. Even if Carranza had not been Spanish, Paul would have agreed, probably, with his imprisonment. Remember, this is the Pope who imprisoned Moroni and would have imprisoned Cardinal Pole if he hadn't died for being too accommodating with the Protestants. And they didn't. What they did was not as far. They did not go as far as Carranza had. So this left the Spanish Inquisition with the problem of what to do with Carranza. To have the primate of the country imprisoned for heresy was a hideous embarrassment. To burn him at the stake would be sacrilege because he was ordained. Being unable to decide what to do with him, they just simply left him in prison, just left him in a dungeon. 5 years later, still in a dungeon, at Session 25, the Council of Trent, on December 3rd, 1563, created the Congregation of the Index of Forbidden Books to systematize and oversee the index itself, which had been created by Paul IV in 1557. Carranza was still in prison. He appealed to this new congregation to review his work. The index obliged, and in 1564 declared that the book was not heretical, because the book did not defend any of the propositions as true, just merely stated them. This was the first case which revealed a huge problem that had been overlooked by Trent. The question of jurisdiction between the Inquisition and the Index. Both dealt with matters of doctrine. But the Inquisition ended up taking precedence since they had possession of Carranza, and the Index was still so new that it had no mechanism for taking over a juridical proceeding. So Carranza remained in prison for 3 more years until the reign of Pius V. Having absolutely no patience with bureaucratic infighting and dismissing, the pride of the inquisitors as irrelevant, Pius commanded that Carranza be brought to Rome in 1567 for trial. Reading the book himself, Pope Pius said, well, yes, it is heretical. And he told Carranza that he must remain in prison and do penance for the rest of his life for having so stained the dignity of the sacrament of holy orders. Pope Pius felt this was the only way that Carranza had any hope of avoiding an eternity in hell. 9 more years passed until the reign of Gregory XIII. While still a cardinal, he had been sent to Spain as a legal advisor on the case, so he knew the story well. By 1576, Carranza had been in a dungeon for 17 years. Pope Gregory took pity on him. By this point, he was a completely broken man in health and spirit. He told Carranza that if he publicly disavowed 16 propositions from the book which had been condemned, that he would be released, with the understanding, first, that he could never exercise his jurisdiction as archbishop ever again. Second, he would make a visitation of the 7 basilicas of Rome as a public penance. Third, he would remain for the rest of his life in the Dominican priory near their church in Rome, Santa Maria sopra Minerva. On April 14th, 1576, Carranza agreed. He fulfilled the necessary conditions, and he died later that year. It shows his health was already destroyed. But he did die in good standing with the church. The most shameful episode during Gregory XIII's pontificate concerned his governance of the papal state. And herein is why he was not able to fund, why he was having, he could not continue funding France during the religious wars, which is why Henry III, first Charles IX, then Henry III, had to agree to grant concessions to the Huguenots. As we've seen, all popes believed without question that the Holy See must remain independent to fulfill its mission, and that maintaining independence required the existence of and the control of the papal states. Pope Gregory had the good fortune of following Pope Pius V, who was very frugal and conscientious in his governance, meaning that Gregory inherited a papal treasury that was full and debt-free. This financial independence enabled Gregory to fund his strategy of governance, such as opening nunciatures and funding his vast educational endeavors, opening all those seminaries. Yet eventually, math is going to catch up. It was impossible to indefinitely subtract from the treasury more than was being added. When the treasury was empty, and Gregory had all these new institutions to support, so remember, you open these schools, that's not just the cost of building. That's, you got to pay all the salaries. All these people have to be fed. It has to be maintained. You have to have a faculty. It's a drain. Constant, building year after year after year. So he began looking around for new sources of revenue. One source was imposing tolls and tariffs on trade goods coming into and leaving the papal state. Now this slowed down trade, which in the long run meant less revenue for the papal state. Another source of revenue was suggested to him by his own curia, to investigate the titles to all the different fiefs in the papal state. If investigation proved that those fiefs were not legitimately held, then they could be confiscated and become part of the personal domain of the papacy, so he would keep all the revenue, rather than simply being held in vassalage by someone else, in which case he would only get a part of the revenue. Now, because of the great age of the papal state, some of the fiefs had been held by the same family since the Middle Ages. Yet most no longer had the means to prove their titles of ownership. Like they didn't have a piece of paper that was 800 years old, that showed that they could trace the title, so to speak. In other cases, the fiefs were obtained from corrupt bureaucrats during the reigns of one of the all too many irresponsible popes we've covered previously. In either scenario, once confiscated, the income from the fief went entirely into the papal treasury, rather than only the vassal portion received up to that point. This initiative of confiscation temporarily had the effect of replenishing Gregory's treasury, yet in the long run it proved to be flawed. First, because the number of fiefs that could be confiscated in that way was limited. Once exhausted, the new source of income dried up, but the new expenses he had incurred still remained. See, math is always going to math is always going to win. Second, the families dispossessed in this way were either relegated to homelessness or had to survive by forming gangs of bandits, which plagued the papal states. Or they remained as sharecroppers on land that they had grown up believing was theirs, at least their fief, making them sullen and resentful and easy prey to those stirring up rebellion against the Holy See. From 1580 on, in effect the last 5 years of his pontificate, much of the papal state outside of the cities was in a state of anarchy and violence, with travel being impossible for anyone not part of a large and heavily armed group. Now, like all human beings, Gregory made mistakes, and this was a huge one. If nothing else, it proved that in the long run, good ethics means good administration, and bad ethics is just bad. On the bright side, showing that the Holy Spirit, still never completely abandons us, no matter how much, how much you try to drive him away. St. Philip Neri. We've alluded to him previously, but the oratory he founded was approved by Pope Gregory XIII, so that's why I'm going to do the detailed treatment of him here. St. Philip Neri, Neri, was born in Florence, Italy, in 1515, into a middle-class family. His father was a notary. He was a religious person, even as a child, but was afflicted with a restless nature and uncertainty about what to do with his life. At the age of 18, he moved to Rome, where he supported himself as a tutor, putting to good use the education he received from the Dominicans in Florence. For 2 years, he lived a reclusive life, spending hours visiting the churches of Rome in silent prayer. He then began studying philosophy and theology at the Sapienza College in Rome, but gave it up after 3 years, even to the point of selling the books he had collected for that purpose. Still not certain what to do, but needing to do something, he started visiting local hospitals and volunteered to help. His personal spirituality at this point, still a layman, consisted in regular visits to his 7 favorite churches and private visits to the catacombs of St. Sebastian, where he often spent the night. It was while in prayer in those catacombs, on the eve of Pentecost in the year 1544, that he had a profound religious experience that took the form of a consolation of divine love. After that, he found his purpose. He had a direction and purpose. He founded a group for laymen, at this point he's still a layman, called the Confraternity of the Most Holy Trinity. Initially, their ministry consisted in visiting the sick and providing hospitality to pilgrims visiting Rome. But it soon developed into a hospital, all on its own. Santa Trinità del Pellegrini, the Holy Trinity for pilgrims. Under an act of obedience to his confessor, he sought and received ordination as a priest on May 23rd, 1551, something he had refused up to that point because he felt unworthy. At the oratory or chapel, we covered in previous lectures what that means canonically. At the chapel of San Girolamo in Rome, Girolamo, Philip gathered around him a small but loyal following of people who saw his holiness and knew he could teach them how to reach God. Pope Gregory XIII gave formal approval to this group in 1575 as the Congregation of the Oratory. Philip conceived of them as priests living in community, but taking no vows beyond those of celibacy and obedience. Each house was to be independent, as Philip saw centralization as a mask for the dead hand of bureaucracy. In his words, each house should live by its own vitality or perish of its own decrepitude. St. Philip's approach was simple, but it was so effective at re-evangelizing Rome that he earned the title, the second apostle of Rome. For St. Philip, devotion to the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist was the foundation upon which any substantive spiritual life must be constructed. To this end, he began promoting the 40 hours devotion as a structured means of Eucharistic adoration. There has never been a historical consensus as to who exactly invented this devotion. Both St. Philip as well as St. Charles Borromeo promoted it. St. Charles in Milan, St. Philip in Rome. But Charles Borromeo wrote that the practice was already in Milan among the faithful when he arrived, so even he didn't claim to have invented it. The earliest written record of the practice of the movement of the Blessed Sacrament from church to church in Milan for 40, actually it was 40 days originally, is one which attributes the idea to a local Capuchin, Friar Giuseppe di Fermo, in 1537, where it was called the Quarantore, Quarantore. Whoever began it. The premise of the devotion was that Jesus actually spent 40 hours in the tomb, during which time the harrowing of hell took place. 8 hours on the night of Friday, Good Friday, 24 hours on Saturday, and 8 hours in the early morning on Sunday. The parallel with the 40 days he spent in the desert at the beginning of his ministry is obvious. As St. Philip promoted this devotion in Rome, a definite liturgical pattern developed. The 40 hours would open at one church with a solemn high mass, concluding with exposition, and the Blessed Sacrament would remain in the monstrance for 40 hours straight, but not in the same place. It would be taken in procession to 3 churches on Friday, Saturday, Sunday during the 40 hours. On the second day, a Mass for peace would be offered, and the Eucharistic devotions celebrated, culminating during hour 40 in the third church with a Mass of deposition, when the Blessed Sacrament would be removed from the monstrance and returned to the tabernacle. During the exposition, 20 candles were to be kept lit. All statues and other objects of devotion in the church were to be covered, so that all attention would be on the Lord. And of course, watchers had to be present at all times. So this is, today we have the perpetual adoration. So this was, but this is a step in that continuity. So in the medieval course, we covered the Corpus Christi, the institution of that feast, and Thomas Aquinas wrote the Pange Lingua, which includes the Tantum Ergo and O Salutaris for that, so that the benediction exposition in the 13th century. So here in the 16th century we have this development of that 40 hours devotion, and then in the 20th century, late 20th century, recovery of that and promotion of perpetual adoration in special chapels. St. Philip began informally at first, giving talks on Sunday evening in his church. Remember, there's no evening mass because of the fast regulations. All masses were early. He was evidently a powerful speaker, preacher, because he had to keep moving into larger and larger churches. His themes were always simple: the lives of the saints, example of Jesus and the Holy Family, biblical stories, and what virtues of theirs we can imitate in our lives. Philip became renowned also as a confessor, encouraging revival of that sacrament of reconciliation, which in Rome at that time had fallen into disuse by ordinary Catholics because either they had no respect for the worldly clergy they saw around them because of the feudalism problem, or because many of those just didn't bother, hearing confessions because they didn't bother doing anything because their families forced them into the church. St. Philip's personal apostolate in this regard was care for the sick. But central to his preaching was that each person, lay or ordained, had the means of living out the works of mercy among the faithful. So here's an example of his writing. This is a personal one. It's a letter that he wrote to his niece. His niece was a nun. And in religion, this was Sister Maria Vittoria Trievi. So Maria, obviously you can spell, then Vittoria, Vittoria, and Trievi, Trievi. This is letter number 3 in his collection, dated December 8th, 1575, so written during the reign of Pope Gregory XIII. Her uncle had just died, and he's writing this letter of condolence. Dearest niece, I know that the death of your respected father, may God have taken him to himself in glory, will have caused great sorrow to his family, as well from the loss of so kindly and able a man's guidance, as from his having left the responsibility of his property and family on the shoulders of his son, who was still a very young man, and certainly not of a fit age to be master. For one must have lived long and had much experience to acquire prudence and sound judgment, so as to know how to command and steer the bark, both in calm and tempest. However, have confidence in our good God, and he will give him virtue and wisdom enough to make up for lack of years. And then I know he has had a good education, and I believe that Barnaba, that's her father, has left his affairs in very good order and unembarrassed, so that by continuing to walk in the road pointed out to him, I do not doubt that the family will persevere in well-doing and the fear of God, and in the good management that existed in your father's lifetime. For the reasons already mentioned, I, for my part, have felt much grieved by this loss, and have not failed to pray to God, and to get others to pray for his blessed soul. Neither do I ever forget, either in my sacrifices or prayers, to remember all of you, his children, and my nephews and nieces, begging of Almighty God that you may be assisted by his divine goodness and prudence, as regards the spirit, to the salvation of your souls, and protected as regards your body in your temporal affairs, according as the Lord shall see expedient. I need make no formal offer to you of my services, both because the relationship which exists between us puts me under an obligation to assist you, and also because I can do but very little for you in a temporal point of view, as by the grace of God I am poor and old and infirm.